4 generations being alive at the same time. And that leads to some very interesting effects. Instead of parents dying in their 60s or 70s and people inheriting in their 30s and 40s, you're getting people living into their 80s and 90s and being very productive. And what that does is, you've got this generational stack and you get pressures. You get something called the sandwich generation. You'll get people who are in their 50s and they've still got somebody above them generationally who might be in their 80s and still very active in the family. And then the people in their 50s, they say, well, hang on, I thought I'm next in line, but my children who might be in their 20s and 30s are very capable too. And they're saying, we want to get involved. One person making decisions, that's extreme. That's, an autocracy. Everybody making decisions, that's actually called direct democracy, also known as anarchy. Okay? Then you have what we've got, which is representational democracy. With these families growing and 4 generations at the same time, and if people are having more babies, and wealthy families tend to have more children, that means you're getting more people in the family, more voices, more decision makers. You're getting pressure. You need some sort of orderly handover of power, of transition of power. When is the right time to retire? And my view is never. Rather, I don't use the R word. I use the T word, transition.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on this show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. My guest today is David Werdiger. He's the director of Nathanson Pearson. He's the best-selling author of Transition, How to Prepare Your Family and Business for the Greatest Wealth Transfer in History. He helps high-net-worth families navigate succession planning by drawing on his experience as both a tech entrepreneur and second-generation family member. David, how are you? So nice to see you.
Thanks so much for inviting me to join you, Bogumil. It's morning here for me as we record this, and I'm very excited. You've sent me some fantastic questions. I'm really looking to having a fun discussion with you.
Well, we started talking before I hit record, and I know that we have so much to talk about. I loved your book. I have 1,000 questions, but I want to start with the early days, if you allow me. And I ask my guests about their childhood upbringing and how you think that time shaped you. And you can talk about your family story that you share in the book that I think is very powerful. I think had an influence on you as well.
It's very interesting when people say, tell me your story. And I speak now that I'm in my 3rd career, which I am as a professional career. But then I actually speak about my 0th career, and that is the family that I grew up in, which is such an important part of why I ended up doing what I'm doing. So my late father came to Australia after the Second World War, having survived the Holocaust, having convalesced for 4 years in a sanatorium in Switzerland. and lost most of his family. And he was a pretty amazing person, because despite having gone through that, he was just so positive about everything. And I know, Australia was a haven for Holocaust survivors after the war, and a lot of them ended up in Melbourne, where I'm from, or in Sydney. And some of them were deeply broken by the experience. My uncle, who ended up in New York, he was a bitter man his entire life there. And my father was, you could not have imagined how somebody could be so positive despite going through that. So, he was a workaholic. He worked very hard supporting our family, building a business, working with his cousins. We were very close with them. My two uncles died quite young, and my father ended up being, de facto father and provider for three families. So the family business loomed large. And I was the youngest of five by a long gap. And I would go into the business. I'd work there as a child, as a student during university. And I actually felt a little bit self-conscious, being this little kid, the boss's son, thinking, what do they think of me? Am I going to be their boss one day, or something like that? And by the time I finished university, I sort of said, I don't want to do this. I'm considering myself in a very fortunate position, being the youngest. There were three other family members, brother, brother-in-law, and cousin, all already in the family business, all very well established, all 10 plus years older than me. So that age gap is really important, because I said, what sort of environment am I going into if I choose to join the family business? That was part of it. But the other part, I think, which was more important, is the burning need to get a job on my own merits. And I think that's been a strong theme in my life, because my family, quite a prominent name in Melbourne. In Melbourne, it's a big city, but it's still a town. And I thought for a lot of my life, people were not treating me, but thinking of me as by my surname instead of my first name, is the simplest way to put it. Who are you? Oh, you're his son. You're part of this family. No, I'm me. Or sorry, I'm not one or the other. I'm both. But
Right.
Which one do you choose to emphasize? And, when we meet people, sometimes we'll go in with expectations about them without even knowing them, when instead it behooves us to sort of get to know the person, get to know the individual.
Very much so. I want to ask you about the business itself. If you can share a little bit, what was it? What is it? And how did it get started? Your family moved to Australia with probably limited resources, I imagine. How did it get started?
Yeah, so my cousins, they came to Australia before the war, okay, in the 20s. They were the smart ones, I guess. And my father's family, that branch, they stayed and were decimated. So my father, after a long convalescence, he's sponsored to come to Australia by his cousins. And this is now late 40s, early 50s. And the booming industry in Australia is manufacturing, textile manufacturing, or what we call the rag trade. So the business was manufacturing textiles, fabrics, and they were doing printing, like thermal transfer printing, knitting and weaving. And my father was sponsored by his uncle, joined his two cousins in business together, and the business thrived. And it had a large factory employing a few hundred people in a town called Geelong. Or I better not call it a town, I'll call it a city, but it's about an hour out of Melbourne. And then another factory. But the thing is, the business was clearly generating cash, and the question is, what do you do with that money? And my father and his cousins, they said, we're going to start investing in property. We're going to diversify.
Right.
And this is a fascinating pattern of behavior, which I observed quite common among Holocaust survivor families coming to Australia and probably elsewhere. And years later, I did when I was doing a Masters of Entrepreneurship, I did a project where I interviewed three. The project was about immigrant entrepreneurship. And so I interviewed three people who had come to Australia with nothing, survived great adversity, were very successful. And of course, one of them was my late father and a couple of other family friends. And this pattern of coming here with nothing, growing a business, but then wanting to invest in real estate. I saw the theme there as saying, my roots have been destroyed in my home country. I have a new home country. How do I build roots? Two ways: family and bricks and mortar. And that was the psychology behind it. So eventually in Australia, with this textile manufacturing industry, you had three choices. You could either offshore, you could close it down, or you could sell it. And so in the end, my father closed it down, for various reasons, but continued to invest in property and continue to do even better from that. So from a family business perspective, it went from a family business that had employed a large number of people to a property ownership and management business, which was much smaller, but controlling significant assets. So that was that's the business side of the story. And, even though I never joined the business, I would regularly catch up with my father and he'd explain to me how it works and I'd understand it, but didn't ever work in it.
I see similar stories with my clients. I manage stock portfolios for wealthy families. And first of all, I hear the immigrant story more often than not. And second, I see this transition from the original business either to a collection of businesses or as a bridge between the two, property, real estate, because that feels like an easier path and maybe some safety that you talk about in the book that I'll come back to later on. But it's fascinating how those stories rhyme across time and across the globe. The immigrant story, how they think about risks and how the original business might not be the one that will go on forever and you have to find other places for the capital. I want to ask you about the book itself. You talk about the greatest wealth transfer in history. And I'm very curious, how is it different today than ever before? And there's so many things that are different about this particular one. The size of it. You mentioned how many generations are around at the same time. Can you introduce the audience to this huge phenomenon that we're facing?
So the idea of this great wealth transfer, I think it started, we have this notion of generations. And the baby boomer generation looms very large in society, in pop culture, and we have generational wars, so to speak, the generation gap. And what happened was some people did some analysis of this generation, and the generation officially starts after the Second World War, sort of 1948. And people said, well, hang on, the earliest baby boomers were born in 1948. They've done very well for themselves for a number of reasons. It was a time of economic prosperity, and they happened to be the generation that lived through that. And then they said, well, hang on, they're going to start retiring at age 65, which was, I think, around 2013. What is going to happen when they retire? They've made all this money, created these assets. What are they going to do with them? Are they going to go skiing, as in spending your kids' inheritance? No, because they grew up in a very conservative time and they will tend to be conservative with money and savers rather than spenders. So they're going to hand them over to their children. And then people started calculating how much this was and realized that it's huge. And that thus begun this narrative of the great wealth transfer. But you ask, why is this different? First of all, generation gaps have been happening for as long as they've been generations. And the reason we have generation gaps is because we are, as people, we're a mix of nature and nurture. We're part of it, influenced by genetics, we're influenced by the family we grew up in, but we're also influenced by the things that were going on around the time we were forming our views about the world. Right. So, my parents who grew up through the war have strong views about risk, have strong views about culture, about family, about the nature of war. And those are completely different. They look at the world completely differently to somebody who's their child, who's born up thinking, what do you remember? I remember when Princess Di died, okay? That was significant, that whole royal family narrative. I don't remember the Second World War. You see war nowadays, but you look at it very differently because we don't have conscription. So all of these things that happen during our formative years help form our identity. And it's fundamentally different because the environment is different. So that's a given. And everybody will say, the previous generation had it better. And I say, bullshit. Every generation has got its issues, its opportunities, and its challenges. But I think what's unique about this, and I'll talk about the size of it because it's not been talked about well. I think the significance is increasing age, increasing life expectancy is massive. Because in the olden days, people would, retire in their 60s and die in their 70s, and children would inherit in their 40s, okay? These days, you've got 4, maybe 5 generations alive at the same time. My mother, bless her, she's nearly 90, and she's got great-great-grandchildren. So we've got a fairly large family. And a friend of mine put this really well. In the olden days, the will used to be the important document. These days, it's the family charter. Because wealth is being... well, it is or it isn't, but the best way to think about it is King Charles, okay? King Charles grew up his entire life saying, one day you'll be king, one day you'll be king. And I'm not sure if he ever said it, Mummy, when,
I'm sure it came up.
I'm sure it did. But there's a lot of King Charleses or maybe Prince Charleses out there who are thinking, I'm in my 50s, in my 60s, in my 70s. I wish my parents very well. But what is that wealth doing for the benefit of the family in the custody of people who don't actually need it for the duration of their life?
Beautifully put.
I think about that I think in terms of marginal benefit.
Mm-hmm.
So if there is significant wealth in a family, and if it is the intent of the family to transmit that to their children, the question is when. And in the olden days, it was when we die. Nowadays, with increasing life expectancy, you've got to challenge that and say, for parents in their 70s, what are their needs for the remainder of their lives? And for their children who might be in their 30s and 50s, what are their needs? And how can this wealth be best deployed for the greater benefit of the family?
I can see that. When I was listening to you, I was also thinking of Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, who got to live, Charlie, I think a few months short of 100. And you have the power of compounding. You said 65, you retire. But I've seen those studies that show that Buffett created or accumulated 95% or 97% of his wealth after the age of 65. Obviously, it's an extreme example. But I think what I'm getting at is that at 65, once you have the capital and it's invested in a productive way, by the time you're 95, it could be a lot more. And the problem is even bigger. You're pointing out the fact that you have those 3 decades when the kids are aging and not benefiting from it, which leads me to another question that comes. It's an interesting point in your book, that it's not just transfer of wealth, but it's also a transfer of power. Can you talk about that aspect?
Yes. Yeah. When I saw that question, my eyes lit up because a colleague and I are about to publish a big piece on power.
Uh-huh.
And I think the topic of power, just quickly back to investment. I'm not an investment professional. I am an investor.
Mm-hmm.
And I love, there's a few things that Morgan Housel writes on investment that I really love.
Mm-hmm.
But, compound interest, I think it's called the eighth wonder of the world. If you have ordinary returns compounding over a long period of time, that leads to spectacular results. So, compound interest is your friend as long as it's working in your favor. But going back to power, the work I do with families revolves around non-financial family capital. So not a wealth advisor, not a lawyer, not an accountant. I'm a family guy. Okay, I come from a family. I understand family dynamics. I also have a background in entrepreneurship and business and non-profit governance. But if the two of us were in an elevator of a short building, and you said to me, "What do you do?" I would say, "I help families make good decisions together." And that goes to what is a decision, what is a good decision, and how do we make them together as a family? And families. Wealthy families start with entrepreneurship most of the time, and entrepreneurs have a particular personality profile. They're tough, they're tenacious, they know what's best, they make decisions quickly, they make decisions on behalf of others. And that's it's an archetype of a certain person. And the very things that make entrepreneurs successful, that self-belief, are the things that make it very, very hard for them as they get older to let go. And, my father, very successful, but I called him benevolent, patronizing. He knew what was best for everybody. And that comes down to power, but it also comes down to trust and transparency. So, a lot of people from that generation, grew up in difficult times and learned that you can't trust people. And the question is, can you trust your children? And that I think is a big barrier for a lot of families. Trusting your children and allowing your children to be themselves, to spread their own wings, to become their own people, to take responsibility for family wealth. So going back to decision making and governance, good governance, and I learned governance from the nonprofit world, and then I took it into the family world. So, and the term family governance doesn't resonate with people. That's why I talk about decision making, making decisions together. The most significant change for a family is when they go from G1 to G2, from one decision maker to more than one. I remember when in my business, I had a CEO, but I was 100% owner, and things were going very well. And the CEO says, we had a discussion about comp, He'd like to become an owner. We did a deal. Suddenly he's an owner, minority owner. But for me, everything changed. I couldn't do all of the things that I was doing in the business as a 100% owner because now I was less than 100% and I suddenly had to consider another owner.
Right.
So as soon as you have more than one owner, and when I say owner, I'm going to expand that and I'm going to say future owner. The whole idea of future ownership, your children are, if you choose to pass down the wealth to them, future owners. Now, that wealth may be locked up in your legal control until you choose to hand that over. But what does it mean to be a future owner? It means you've got to prepare them to be an owner. If you've got clients, Bogomil, and you are advising them to invest in Apple shares, okay? What training do you need to invest in Apple shares? Zero.
Yeah, that's true. You could say that.
Yeah. I don't need training to be an owner of Apple. Okay? They're a listed company. I put my money down to a stockbroker. I buy shares and I'm an owner of Apple. On the other hand, if I'm a member of a family and I'm going to in future become an owner, I'm not buying Apple shares. Okay? I've won the genetic lottery. Okay, born into a wealthy family. All right, good. And at some point in the future, I will be one of a number of people in control of significant wealth. What do I need to do that well? What do I need to learn? And it's the responsibility, learning that responsibility to be a good owner, to be a good inheritor. And I'm sort of drifting a little bit, but I'll go back to this notion of one person, from one person in charge to more than one person. As soon as you've got more than one person in charge, or in the future going to be in charge, they've got to learn to make decisions together. As soon as they're making decisions together, that's called governance, the rules by which we make decisions. And you've got power imbalances. You've got parents and you've got children. You've got seniority within children. You've got different ability within children. And so all of that goes to the power dynamics, and that relates to how decisions are made. I remember going back to my business, when I chose to set up an advisory board and step back from an operational role, my presence, despite calling myself non-executive, my presence was still palpable in the business. People would defer to me on decision making or say, what would David say about this, rather than making the decisions that I was trying to empower them to make. Simply by sitting in a room, if you look at a room and a board table, the family board table is not the family board table, it's the kitchen table. And the identical dynamics that are in the room, in the kitchen table, are there in the board table decades later. The dynamics between the parents and the children, the power that the parents have. Somebody before saying something might look to a parent for approval. And the body language, the people sitting like this, or the people sitting alpha male and, around the table, the positioning at the table, who sits where. All of these things go to the power dynamics that are in the room. And you want power dynamics that can drive good decision making. It all comes down to Spider-Man's uncle. Okay.
Tell me more.
With great power comes great responsibility. So, families of significant wealth, they have power coming from that wealth. They have a responsibility to use that power well. And that's actually, it came before Spider-Man's uncle. But so that transfer of power is really important. And it means, as I said before, teaching the children from an appropriate age that yes, you are going to be future owners, but with great power comes great responsibility, and I've got to teach you the responsibility that comes with that. There's a quid pro quo. There's no you can do whatever you want. Families that do it well say, you can do whatever you want with this, but you have a responsibility to do it well. That Warren Buffettism. I'll give my children enough that they could do anything, but not so much that they can do nothing.
Beautifully put.
So that double-sided coin of saying you've got privilege, you've got power, you've got wealth. How are you going to use that for good rather than descend into a hedonistic, self-destructive life, which you could do? So, yeah, handing over power is what's really happening.
You're touching on so many fascinating aspects of the universe we're talking about. And I work with families that are usually past the initial business, and the money is in a collection of businesses. But I see the same dynamics that you talk about, and I've worked with multiple generations. I knew the original grandfather, father, or grandmother that created the wealth. And then there was one person that really had the dominant say in matters for a long period of time. And the children, no matter their age, and sometimes they were already in their 40s or 50s, would always wait for the parent to say what's next. And then once that parent disappears, it creates a whole new dynamic. And you mentioned there are multiple people participating. And I want to take it in a couple of directions. One, you mentioned how just because you grew up together with the same parents, you don't have to get along, especially when you throw in money into it. And I also want to talk about the time dimension here. And you mentioned it in the book, and it really made me pause. You said this is the first time in history when we might have 4 generations living together at the same time. It really made me think, 4 generations, we're talking about 100-year coverage back to back, right? It's incredible. Talk to me about the siblings and talk to me about this 100-year time span that we're really touching here.
Siblings share genetic material. Okay, but they're individuals. And I think the line I use in the book is just because 2 people come out of the same womb doesn't mean they'll get on.
Mm-hmm.
You have complex dynamics within families. You have differences like age differences. Birth order is very significant in families. There are a lot of people who write about various archetypes of the firstborn, the secondborn, the rebel. I'm the youngest, I'm the 5th, and I'm the 5th after a gap. In my family, my siblings all a cluster of 4 of them born over about 5.5 years. They grew up in a family that was becoming wealthy. I grew up in a family that already was wealthy. So the way I put it is every child is born into a different family. So, you start a family with a couple, they'll have a child. So first of all, as a couple, they are a family. They're a unit. And they get used to things as they are. And suddenly, there's a baby and that shakes things up. And then they settle down into that. And then there might be another baby. That baby is born into a different family. That family is a family. So the first baby is born into a family that's a couple. The second baby is born into a family that is a couple and a child of, might be 2, 3, it might be 10. Okay. So again, going back to generations, going back to us being a product of the environment we grew up in, every child is born into a slightly different environment. Every child is slightly different genetically, assuming they're not identical twins. And even identical twins have their differences, and there's, twin studies to show that. So expecting all of our children to get on, to be similar. Our children are similar. My wife and I, our children are 5 completely different people. And, we'll see bits of ourselves in them and we'll cringe and we'll smile and, we see them growing up and having children of their own. But to expect them to look at the world the same way, to think the same way, sure, there is a lot they have in common. The way I think about it is we are part of a collective as members of a family, and we're also individuals. And the culture of the collective versus the individual is different as you go around the world. And Dennis Jaffe wrote a great book about this, examining different cultures. So in the US, it's a very individualist culture. The individual is everything. It's a rights-based culture. On the other hand, in Asia, it's a collectivist culture. Family is more important. But I'm a Goldilocks guy, okay? That is to say, I don't like extremes. So if you look at the extremes and you can say, family is everything. You've got a responsibility to the family. You have to join the family business, okay? Or the individualist, go do your own thing. If I'm lucky, I'll see you for Christmas. No, let's find that Goldilocks zone where we have that comfortable blend of understanding that you're part of a collective, but also being yourself. And if any one of those things is too strong, that's not a healthy balance. So finding that balance between being part of a family and being your own person, that is the great challenge. It's the same with power and trust. Too much power, concentration, leads to poor decision making. It leads to, by definition, disempowerment. Okay, so if you've got a family where there's a concentration of power, one person is using their power to make decisions, that can lead to other people being disempowered. How does it feel to be disempowered? How does it feel when, as a group of, a sibling partnership or a cousin collective, one of them is dominating and you say, hang on, why are you more important than me? We're all equal members of this family. And that we can go off on a whole tangent with that one. Fair versus equal. Power should be shared in a responsible way. And it doesn't mean we live in a pure democracy. Parents will say, we've said this to our children. This is not a democracy. So your other question was about 4 generations being alive at the same time. Yes.
Yes.
And that leads to some very interesting effects. As I said, instead of parents dying in their 60s or 70s and people inheriting in their 30s and 40s, again, assuming things go according to the natural order, you're getting people living into their 80s and 90s and being very productive. And what that does is, you've got this generational stack and you get pressures. You get something called the sandwich generation. You'll get people who are in their 50s and they've still got somebody above them generationally who might be in their 80s and still very active in the family. And then the people in their 50s, they say, well, hang on, I thought I'm next in line, but my children who might be in their 20s and 30s are very capable too. And they're saying, we want to get involved. Now, I spoke about going from one person making decisions to more than one person. But then, again, one person making decisions, that's extreme. That's, an autocracy. Everybody making decisions, that's actually called direct democracy, also known as anarchy. Okay? Then you have what we've got, which is representational democracy, where everybody elects people to make decisions on their behalf. So with these families growing, and 4 generations at the same time, and if people are having more babies, and wealthy families tend to have more children because they can, because the finance is not a barrier to having kids, that means you're getting more people in the family, more voices, more decision makers. You're getting pressure from what's called sandwich generations, the generations who are looking up at their parents who are getting old and down at their children who are already adults and capable. And if everybody puts their hand up and wants to make a decision, then you have anarchy, you have disorder. So you need some sort of orderly handover of power, of transition of power. And with that transition of power, again, the other effect of 4 generations or more being alive at the same time is, when is the right time to retire? And my view is never. Rather, I don't use the R word, I use the T word, transition. So I'll give you an example of a family I'm working with. The father decided to transition the managing director role to one of his children, but the father is not 70 or 80. He's, 60, give or take. And he says, I'm not retiring. Don't even say that word in front of me. And I remember when I used the terminology stepping back, and my intent was stepping back from the managing director role, from a role intensely in the operating business. He said, no, I don't like that. We're not saying stepping back, because for him, and the words we choose are so important to talk about these changes, because they evoke sensitivities of people. Don't put me off to pasture. So, Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, doing this stuff into their 80s and 90s, fantastic, cognitively intact, good on them. On the other hand, this guy who's the founder, and he's 60, give or take, he says, yes, I think it's important that my son take that MD role, but what is next for me? And so, when I think about transition, I think everybody needs to be thinking about their next chapter. Whether you're in your 30s, the so-called rising generation saying, what's my place within the family enterprise? What's the stamp I'm going to leave on the world? To their parents who might be 50s and 60s thinking, hopefully I'll live a healthy life into my 80s and 90s. But that future, that next chapter for me doesn't have to be moving to playing golf or playing, whatever it is old people in Miami play, bridge. It can be a very productive life. And this is where we have the concept of the elder within a family. And the elder is a fantastic concept, which we may not have had in earlier generations because they just died. But an elder can be somebody in their 60s, in their 70s, in their 80s, who has a role within the family enterprise. And that role arises because they're still alive, they're still healthy, they're still productive. They want to continue to give. Mm-hmm. And the biggest thing holding families back is fear of being not important. If you're a founder of the business, okay, you started it, you worked in it, you get to your 60s and 70s, the kids are working in the business, but you say, what am I going to do? The business is my identity. And the way I describe this best is children, okay? When you start a business, it's like having a child. Biological children, they are created, well, not by one person, by 2 still, but it's life created from scratch. A business is something new created from scratch. And just like children start as babies and grow up into adults, businesses start as babies and grow into adults. When your business child is a baby, it wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning screaming, just like your biological child. Okay?
That's true.
Yeah, that's the experience of a founder. Damn, how the hell am I going to make payroll this month? Or, how am I going to deal with this crisis? Okay? I've been through that as a business founder. But then your business grows up. Your business starts to become more mature and take on a life of its own. But think about it this way. Your biological children, if you've got more than one, compete for your attention. Your biological children are competing for attention with your business child. So my client says, yes, I want to move into a new role. One of the reasons is I recognize that in 30 plus years in this business, I put the business ahead of my children. I wasn't always there for my children. I want to be there for my children. So that tells you, one, he's recognized and acknowledged that, and he's done it at a good age. But two, he recognizes that his biological children compete with his business child for his attention. Now, when we start a business, it's an embodiment of our identity. It carries a lot of our values as an entity, the people we hire, the culture in the business. And so our identity as a founder, as a business founder, is bound up in that business. I work with families and I also work with owner-led businesses. And owner-led businesses, I work with them on governance, on decision-making, on how to make sure that they can create value in the business, that the business is valuable without them. And, a lot of people will say, I want to exit this business and I want to get a big payday. And most consultants who will work with businesses on exit readiness, they'll work across the financial aspect of the business, the operational aspect of the business, the organizational aspect of the business. And I do some of that, but the area that I work that they don't work in is the emotional side of the business. Because recognizing that the founder's identity is bound up with that of the business, and people for whom their business is everything, if they don't have their business, what are they? I ask those questions of the founder, and I help the founder reach a place where they're comfortable with it. Because too often, somebody will sell a business, be unprepared, and the morning after they've sold the business, they've got a big hunk of liquidity in their bank account. So they call you and say, how do I invest this? I'm post-operating business. They've got a big hunk of liquidity in their bank account, but they've got a matching hole in their heart because they've said, oh shit, I've lost something. I had something that was a part of me. I created it from scratch. I nurtured it when it was a baby, kept me up all night. I was there for it, and now it's gone. OMG. And all I've done is replace it with meaningless cash. That's not meaningless, but it doesn't have soul. A business has soul. So, that's not a good result. So this goes to, again, 4 generations, the notion of elder saying, I want to transition to a new role where I rewrite my next chapter, my new identity, not necessarily tied to this operating business, not necessarily tied to wealth, but tied to something far more important, which is values, which is meaning, which is purpose.
Which was something I wanted to ask you about as I was listening to you about values and stories. I did want to mention how when I think of investing a family fortune, whether if it's in one business and in my case a collection of them, I think of an infinite investment horizon. Families really have an open-ended opportunity. And it's an opportunity and a challenge. I think the challenge is in imagining who will actually benefit from this fortune or the business. And when you have 4 generations, when I was reading your book, I was thinking for the first time we can get on top of the hill and see that far, because you can actually hold that great-great-grandchild, right? Isn't it amazing and wonderful that you could actually see the face and hold the human that will benefit from what you're setting up? In the spirit of planting trees for others to enjoy, in many cases, you will never meet the people who will enjoy the shade of the trees you planted. But in this case, we get a glimpse so far ahead. It makes me think of Jay Hughes, who I'm sure you know. He talks about asking around the table, family table, who do you remember that was around when you were a kid? How far back we can look. And in some cases, you could talk to one of your grandparents at some point and realize that they knew somebody that was around 100 some years ago, right? So we're looking 100 years back. But with what you're saying, we could be looking more than 100 years ahead, which is way beyond most people's thinking. So that's what gave me chills when I was thinking about the 4 generations.
I think it's a fantastic point, and Jay Hughes is a friend and has said some fantastic things, and really quite a big influence on my life and my career. Actually, if you'll indulge me,
please.
I was at a Jay Hughes webinar. I remember it like yesterday because it was one of those moments, and he's talking about he's got a client who's in his 60s, and that person is the custodian of somebody else's dreams rather than a creator of his own dreams. And at that moment, I had that penny drop moment, and I suddenly understood why I had done everything in my life for the previous 30 odd years out of that. And that was a brief distraction because I want to get back to this 4-generation thing, but it's a fantastic conceptualization to think of, when people join a family business, a family enterprise, are they doing it out of obligation because somebody says, I need you in the business? Did you ever ask me if I want to be in the business? It's so important for families, and Jay Hughes speaks about the family of affinity. Families to be together because they want to, not because they share some genetic material and some assets. Okay, that's not a family. But going back to your point about 4 generations, to literally be able to see and hold somebody who will outlive you perhaps by 100 years, it's amazing. And what it says about thinking about investment horizons and the investment industry is very interesting. Again, I'm not an investment advisor, but I think we have this fascination with closed funds these days, the closed fund structure. And a closed fund structure is very much about, I'm going to invest with a particular horizon and I need to harvest, okay, because I've got an 8 to 10 year fund life. And what that gets you is, capital returns at a future time and hopefully an IRR. But then it leaves you with a decision: how do I deploy that cash again?
The reinvestment risk.
I've got to reinvest it. I've got to make it do something. I don't want that capital to be lazy. On the other hand, you have another class of assets which is evergreen, whether they're evergreen assets like real estate, or the stock market is a little bit evergreen, or I call them legacy assets because you can just buy them and sit on them forever. And if you are investing with 100 years, okay, and I know some families who try to take this 100-year outlook. I think it's a bit too much. As much as you think, okay, what is life going to look like in 100 years? I think that's too hard to imagine. The pace of change just continues to accelerate. Businesses, when they do strategic planning, they'll say 3 to 5 years. I encourage families to think about 25 years, because 25 years is, a generation. What would life look like? What does our family look like? Look long into the future where you're not going to be there. Write letters to the descendants that you'll never meet. How do we transmit those values? How do we transmit our sense of purpose? We all want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. Families are exactly that. Families were there before us, and hopefully they'll be there after us. So, it's about legacy. It's about what we can pass on to our children that's more than money, that can endure, what part of us can endure for a longer period of time beyond our lifetime. Wealth enables that, but it's not about necessarily wealth. Anybody can do it. Anybody can transmit values and purpose to their family.
Can I marry a few ideas at the same time and ask you? I had a conversation not long ago with somebody I know, and they pointed out to me something that you mentioned, how when the original business is gone, the next generation might be growing up with no recollection of that business at all. But the wealth is there. And we talked about it, and what I realized that the bridge we can create, and you talk about it in the book, is the stories. You can tell the story. And sometimes those stories of the original business, the immigrant story that you talk about in the book, it introduces a whole context to what this family fortune is. It's not just a number. It's not just a statement or collection of statements from the investment firm, but it has a story, an origin, a tale of struggle and growth and risks taken and sacrifices made. Can you talk about those values and stories, how important they are to preserve what we're trying to preserve here?
They are not important. They are everything. The stories we tell, okay? If we think about Yuval Harari's Sapiens, what is it about human beings? Why did we conquer the world? Because of our ability to tell stories. If you look at the oldest cultures, okay? Jewish culture, we tell stories. We've been telling stories for thousands of years. I'm from Australia. Indigenous Australians been telling stories for thousands of years. They are the things that hold us together. And stories are the most powerful thing because they transmit values, they transmit meaning, and we form an emotional attachment to them. So telling stories is about the most important thing we can do to transmit culture. And those origin stories, they need to be told warts and all. Not, everything was fantastic. No, it wasn't. Don't tell me everything was fantastic. Tell me about the hardship that you overcame, okay? I was thinking earlier this morning about resilience and how hard it is to teach resilience. Because, when we talk about values, they say values are caught, not taught. How do I teach my children values? I don't teach my children values. I live the values and they absorb them by osmosis, okay? But how do I teach them resilience? I don't know. I haven't got to the answer to that yet. But if I tell them stories about the experience that I had and how I overcame challenges, that helps resilience. That helps saying, there's going to be times in your life, even though we have plenty financially, that you will have challenges and you will need to overcome them. And those challenges can come from all different ways. And you can draw on the stories, on the experiences of your parents, your grandparents, your family to say, we had challenges. They're going to be different challenges because we live in a different age. But we still had challenges and we overcame them, and that's why we're still here today. And so telling those stories is just the most important thing you can do as a family. Don't send your children to be taught values. Okay? The values are within you. All you have to do is live them, and your children will absorb them. And they'll adapt them too, because they're not clones of you. They're individuals. They will take your values and they will see what they mean to you, and they'll learn from them, and they'll write their own chapters of what their values are, which will be yours plus a little bit, etc., etc., etc.
Thing on top of it, I do want to come back to something you mentioned before. We talked about stories and values, but we mentioned something that I remember from the book, and I wrote it down, that when you join a family business, you're part of the family, you might be living somebody else's dream, and you want to be living your own dream. And I want us to spend a minute on that, because I know that you mentioned decades to living your own dream before you came back to the family dream. And I don't think too many people talk about it. And it's a very important point to remember that you do want to live your own dream before you, in a way, inherit somebody else's dream and continue somebody else's vision. Can you share your experience and how you guide clients on that front?
I think it goes back to this balance between the individual and the collective, creating space for people to become their own person within the environment of a collective. We value the collective. We know the collective is important. We have a lot to be grateful to the family for what we have today, but that doesn't mean that we can't write our own chapters. Okay, you talk about how families, they'll sell the operating business and they'll evolve into something else. And that's what I mean by creating your own dreams. We have the ability to create their own dreams. Not all businesses were meant to be run by family members in perpetuity. Not all businesses were meant to exist in perpetuity. Wealth, on the other hand, is a bit more fungible, and it can evolve and take different forms. In one generation, it might be property. In the next generation, it might be investment. In the generation after that, it might be property again. And that's, thinking about it in those terms and saying, what is it for? Okay, financial wealth is not a goal. Financial wealth is a means to a goal. And, going back to Jay Hughes, he speaks about 5 forms of family capital. Financial capital is the stuff that powers the other forms of capital. But the other forms are actually what are really more important and more enduring, and those are the spiritual capital, our purpose as a family, the social capital, our ability to work together towards a common goal. Again, going back to my experience as an entrepreneur, when I started employing people, it killed me, okay? Because I knew that I could do every single job in that business better than anybody. And then I thought, hang on, there's a small problem. There's only one of me.
Yes.
And this is what families are individuals who together bring their own individuality to write a story that is a story of multiple people working together, and a story that can endure for generations. And that is what it's about. It's about coming together and being something far more than one person, and in fact far more than a collection of people. Because a family is more than a collection of people, as I said, who share genetic material and some shared assets. A family is something that can endure, that can have purpose, that can have meaning, that can bring joy more than anything material can.
I love the sound of that, and there's so much in it. David, I could keep you here all day. I have one big overarching question. What's your definition of success? You had 3 careers, or maybe more. You've seen a lot, you've experienced a lot, and you have a fascinating pursuit right now working with families. How do you think about success on any level, on all levels, however you want to take that question?
I think of success. Look, I'm very blessed because every day I get up in the morning and I'm excited about the things that I do. I think that's success. Getting up in the morning and looking forward to what I'm going to do that day, whatever that is, because that can't be measured. You know, I'm blessed. We've got a family. We've got grandchildren. You know, when I cuddle my grandchildren, when I see them running around and playing with each other, that's success. And because that's something that is just far bigger than me, and it's, you know, seeing your children grow up being adults. Yeah. So family, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
A healthy family who love each other, who want the best for each other, who share each other's success and share each other's joy and are there for each other when there isn't joy. That's the greatest success to me. And, you know, I'm very fortunate to be in a position to help other families do that too.
Beautifully put. Wow, it gave me chills. David, thank you so much for today. This was such a wonderful conversation. I highly recommend your book. And we only scratched the surface of what's in the book, but I think it gives this audience an idea of the topics that are on your mind, the experience that you have, and all kinds of ways that you help people. And you definitely expanded my perspective on that transition that we're facing and how we can go about it. So thank you so much for today.
Thanks so much, Bogomil. I really enjoyed talking to you. And yes, we could continue for hours. We really could.
We'll do a take 2 at some point and continue everything else that we didn't touch on today.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogomil Baranowski.